In this video, we'll be reviewing The Diffusion of Innovations by Everett Rogers, a landmark classic on how we introduce and communicate and socialize new ideas and new innovations. Welcome to Strategy Books, introducing leaders to the books and ideas that make a difference, and most importantly, the books that can help you make a difference in the world around you. Hit the subscribe button to stay current and that bell to be notified every time there's a new video up. I'm Mark Mullally, follow me here, and you can also connect with me on Instagram and Twitter at strategy_books. As always, the links to everything we discussed today can be found in the description below. So, let's get started. And so we are talking about, as I say, a landmark book. The book that Everett Rogers has created, Diffusion of Innovations, is a landmark in its field. It is one of the most cited management books going. It's certainly one of the most cited around innovation and the diffusion of innovations of the subject. And he is really the eminence grise, if you will, or was the eminence grise in terms of how we thought about introducing innovation to the world. Now, Everett Rogers started studying the adoption of pesticides in rural Iowa. He studied and was a practitioner of what was called rural sociology, which was an entire focused discipline. It was where really the idea of diffusion of innovations launched and got its real empirical grounding. And it was all about how agricultural innovations, new seeds, new fertilizers, new equipment, new techniques were introduced to farmers and were introduced to agriculture. And there's an entire system that is built up around doing this, around experiments and research, and about then being able to identify those innovations that are relevant and useful and practical and should ideally be taken advantage of, and then actually operationalizing the mechanism of introducing and working to persuade people to actually adopt that. And so this was really his focus. Is he grew up in Iowa. He studied at State University of Iowa, and his focus in terms of his PhD thesis was the adoption of a particular pesticide and the diffusion of its use and acceptance by the farming community. He finished his career as I started as chair of the Department of Communication and Journalism at the University of New Mexico, and he finished as distinguished professor emeritus there. And this version of the book, which is its 5th edition, was originally published in 2003, and it's the final edition. Unfortunately, he passed away a year after it was published. But the book itself was originally published in its first form in 1962. It's been progressively updated since then, and occasionally it's changed names. The second edition in 1971 was actually the Communication of Innovation, a cross-cultural approach. And then in 83 and 95, and then subsequently this edition in 2003, was released again as the Diffusion of Innovations. Now, how I came across it, it came across my radar a few years ago. I knew some of the theory. I work in change. I work in strategy. I work in getting the adoption of ideas implemented within organizations. And so it's difficult, not impossible mind, but difficult to be able to do that work without coming across this book. It is dedicated to the understanding of how do we actually create change. And while I knew some of the theory, as I said in the introduction, we distill that down to this book is about a particular idea. The concept or the theme of this book is X, and so we walk around with a shorthand definition of what it's actually about. Now, I had this book reinforced for me. A colleague of mine, Peter DeYager, did a webinar in Technability webinar series that can be found on technability.online called S-Curves and Laggards, and it was all about the concepts and ideas, and again, the misinterpretation of those ideas that exist in taking a book of this magnitude and making sense of it. Because there are a lot of common perceptions and there are a lot of common ideas. If you ever heard the word change agent, for example, this book is that source. It's where that idea comes from. And common perceptions around the diffusion of innovations is basically that the adoption of new innovations, whether that's an idea, whether that is a new treatment option that's being prescribed by doctors, or that pharmaceutical companies are working to have doctors prescribe more of. If it's the introduction of a new technology, a new software package, new cell phone model, that there is an S-shaped curve of adoption. It starts off slowly, and it starts off with a group of pioneers, and then it hits a tipping point in critical mass in terms of awareness, where then it is then subsequently taken up and achieves reasonable market share. This is also the book where the phenomena of the expression early adopters came from. If you've ever spoken of early adopters, being an early adopter, the idea of needing to reach early adopters in terms of being able to support or catalyze a change, whether you recognize it or not, you are referencing this book. This is what not just Diffusion of Innovations was about. This is the terminology and language that the book has created in our mindset. And so there are a lot of ideas here that have been planted in our psyche, in terms of our cultural understanding, in terms of our organizational understanding of work and change, where we don't necessarily recognize and acknowledge what the source was of where it came from. Now, what the author was actually trying to do with this book, I think, was a lot. The primary focus, the theme of the book, reduced to a sentence, is it's about how technology is actually introduced and adopted in a society. And it explores the topic of diffusion, which Rogers talks about as being about a process of social change. It's about being able to get the adoption and acceptance of new ideas. And that's new ideas as products, that's new ideas as services, that's new ideas as literal concepts and ideas. It's about techniques, it's about approaches, it's about treatment models, it's about political philosophies even. All of those represent innovations that in some way get introduced, get diffused, get adopted, get accepted, or not, by society and by individuals in society and by organizations in society. And what started me on this journey, what started me on reading this particular book right now, was the book that we talked about last time, this one, The Machine That Changed the World. And I called out their specific and, I would argue, biased wording that they used literally on the first page in their 2007 foreword, where, as we talked about last time, the machine that changed the world was really talking about lean production, and lean production was the author's term for what in essence was the Toyota production system, and it was very much coming from a bias and agenda of advocating for the importance and the value and relevance of lean production as an idea, and the need for the entire world to be able to adopt it. And the specific terminology that I called out, it talked about the mass production system of Ford, saying that the system was then widely copied and used by enterprises in practically every industry all over the globe. And the emphasis there is on widely copied. Versus the other business system, lean production, was pioneered by Toyota in the 20 years immediately after World War II and is now rapidly diffusing to every corner of the world. And every time they talked about the adoption and introduction of lean production, they used that word. They used the word diffusion. And I read that and I called it out and I basically asked myself, do they understand the significance behind that word? And do they really know what it means? Because one of the challenges that the authors actually had was the degree to which, to their shock and surprise, the principles of lean production hadn't been taken up and broadly applied, not just within the world at large, but also within Japanese organizations and Japanese manufacturers, and that there were some North American manufacturers, for example, of vehicles that were producing vehicles that were as good quality and as good efficiency, if you will, productivity in terms of their manufacture, as the in the mid-range as some of the worst organizations in Japan. And so there was some level of catching up, and they found that astonishing, that there wasn't an equivalent level of adoption and use of lean production in Japan. And there was a variable degree of use and adoption of it elsewhere within the world, including adoption by organizations they didn't necessarily think and wouldn't have expected to be able to use and take up those ideas. And yet, that is exactly the point of what this book is about. Adoption is inconsistent. Adoption doesn't happen nicely, and it doesn't happen neatly, and it doesn't happen with any degree of predictability. There's a process, there is a structure, but how that works varies. And there are fundamental reasons behind it, and that is the model of diffusion that Rogers is introducing. And so going back to the idea of diffusion, we're talking about diffusion as a social change. It's about adopting and accepting new ideas, and it's about understanding, so what were the influences that actually either complemented or undermined that adoption by organizations and by members of society and people at large. And it's very much about the diffusion of innovations as technology. And they use technology in a very specific way. Rogers has a very specific determination, or definition, if you will, that it's reducing uncertainty behind the cause and effect relationships in problem solving. In other words, technology writ large is something that makes things easier, something that reduces uncertainty, helps to be able to better do things that you care about, and helps to actually be able to create solutions to problems. And so the diffusion of innovation is in part about the introduction of and how we manage the introduction of solutions to problems that get identified. Now, how it's structured, it is important to acknowledge this is a dense book. It is an academic book. It is actually more academic than I necessarily recognized going into it when I first bought it. That quickly became clear. And it is an exploration of and a discussion of pretty much the entire diffusion literature, which was not exhaustive. It's not, I mean, it's there and it's present, and it has actually emerged into a number of other disciplines and areas of study from rural sociology at its roots. In fact, rural sociology has the idea and study of diffusion has faded significantly, but it's taken hold in other areas. And it's exploring what the research does, how the research works, what the research has resulted in terms of findings, and he's incredibly generous and comprehensive in terms of being able to share and also acknowledge where different ideas and different perspectives and different viewpoints were contributed by different studies and by different scholars and by the landmark publications that have been produced in the diffusion literature. And so it's a little bit of a literature review. But it is much more than that, because it's also trying to introduce and comprehensively define what the diffusion of innovation is and how it works and what it looks like and what its major mechanics and components are. And it is also an agenda of identifying where the flaws and where the difficulties and where the challenges. And so it presents a very logical approach as it actually explores and works through this. It starts with an understanding of just simply the history of research, and it's a really useful overview of how diffusion as a study came to be and how it has taken root in a number of different disciplines. It talks about key contributions and problems of the research. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, because it also highlights a lot of the key issues and problems in terms of how the ideas have been practically applied in organizations as well. It goes through the process of innovation, the actual innovation decision process, how we actually come to adopt something. So if we're talking about cell phones, for example, and this is one that's close to my heart, because I would characterize, at least in the early launch of them in, let's say, the 2000s in particular, I would characterize myself as an innovator or very, very early adopter of new technology. I literally replaced my cell phone at one point, probably on average every 6 months. I was constantly on the lookout for new features and new capabilities and things that it would do that would make my life easier, that I was frustrated by what my current phone wouldn't allow me to actually do. And yet there are times and there are areas and there are technologies and there are parts of my life where I'm nowhere near an early adopter. I'm probably at best laggard. And again, that is a term that is attributable to this book. The introduction of the idea of early adopters and the idea of laggards are again both concepts that have their origins in Rogers' book. And so he talks about the different types of adopter categories. And then we have innovators, we have early adopters, we have the early majority, the late majority, and then the laggards. Talks about the attributes of innovation and what we look for and value within that. The use of networks to be able to manage and support the communication of ideas, the role of the change agent, how we think about innovation in organizations, and also, and I think this is a really important one that probably doesn't get enough focus and attention, is the consequence of innovations. In other words, the impact that and doing something in a particular way has. And we see this a lot in our discussion of different term not related to this book, disruption. And disruption is relatively common in the business press now. It's probably best considered to be the mantra of Silicon Valley, in that it is the business model most organizations pursue. You take an Uber, for example, what Uber was trying to do as an organization is reinvent the process of getting people from point A to point B via some publicly available form of transport. They were trying to reinvent, for want of a better term, the taxi industry. And their whole focus was on disrupting that industry. Now, when we use that in that terms, we start to identify, so what are the consequences of that? As we've seen around the world, taxi drivers did not take that kindly. They viewed it as a threat to their livelihood and their wealth and the significant investment. Sometimes taxi plates, for example, in cities like Toronto or New York are worth literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, or at least they were. And so this process of letting people in a car with an app going and picking up people from point A and taking them to point B and charging them for it and completely undermining the normal public transport mechanisms in a city was viewed very reasonably as disruptive. And the question is, so what's the consequence of that? And a lot of innovators, and particularly a lot of innovators in, I would argue, Silicon Valley, really don't care. They're not considering the consequence to others. They're considering the consequence to their balance sheet, to their bottom line, to the money that goes in their individual pockets, and their ability to be able to create a new industry that is massively profitable and gets them ridiculous valuation that allows them to IPO and move on to whatever the next organization is without really any concern or consequence to what happens as a result. And so there's an entire chapter in the book about the consequence of innovations that my view is ignored at our peril, because we've got to think about what the larger implications of what we do are, because how innovations get approached and how they get shaped have significant consequences. One of the examples in the book, for example, is the growing of, and this is a thing, hardened tomatoes. They taste the same as regular tomatoes. They have almost the same vitamin nutrition content as regular tomatoes, but they are harder, solely for the purpose of being able to enable mechanical harvesting. In other words, they can have a machine that will rip the plants out of the ground, strip the tomatoes off, sort them, and allow them to be selected to be able to get the bad ones removed and be able to get them to market without actually bruising and overly damaging the tomatoes. And that's not something that would have been able to be done with more traditional tomato varieties that are not hard, that are soft, which are frankly our normal preference. But this was a cost-saving invention. It was a labor-saving invention specifically designed at a particular point in time where there was a real and inherent threat to the loss of migrant labor that the tomato industry, particularly in California, relied upon in order to be able to do their harvest. Now, because of the innovation, and specifically because of the design of the machine and the scale that it was designed to be able to build on, what that led to was a rapid shrinking and consolidation of the tomato industry in California. They went from thousands of farms to a few hundred in just a few years. and displaced the jobs of tens of thousands of people by the introduction of hardened tomatoes and the creation of a mechanism for mechanical harvesting. And no real thought to the broader socioeconomic impact of having done that, or the consideration of maybe there's a different way, maybe there's a different model, maybe there's a different scale of automation that needs to be considered. And so what you have is instances of new technologies favoring large and established players that can actually afford to be able to make the investment and have the economies of scale necessary to be able to justify it, at the expense of smaller organizations that simply don't have the economies of scale, don't have the pockets to be able to invest in that kind of technological innovation, and aren't able to take advantage of machinery that was actually built at that scale. And so consequences becomes both real consideration that Rogers himself was very clearly concerned about, but that I think we need to also take into consideration as we consider the implications of what we create and also the implications of what we implement and how we implement it. And so how is the book relevant? Fundamentally, it's essential reference to what I do. My entire career has been, for want of a better term, as a change agent. And I don't use that word in the way that Rogers defines it necessarily, but it is the common parlance that's applied to someone that is typically in my role. What's really relevant for me, though, was the critiques that Rogers contained within the book. One of the things that he talks about very early on is the idea that we have what he refers to as a pro-innovation bias. In other words, innovation is good, innovation should be adopted, and attempting to introduce innovation, success of that should be inevitable. And that pro-innovation bias plays out a lot in how we actually think about managing change and implementing results. The presumption, if we are going to introduce a new innovation to the world, whether that is Netflix as a TV service, whether that is the new model of iPhone, whether that is the creation of a car service like Uber, whatever that might be, the presumption is it's good, it's valuable, and it should succeed. And what doesn't get focused on, what doesn't get considered as a consequence, is where innovations themselves are inappropriate, where they are incomplete, where they are well thought out, or where they don't work as well as they do. There's an inherent bias in the research, for example, to focus on the study of diffusions that work and that are successful and that do produce meaningful and significant change. There is comparatively far less study of innovations that fail. Partly because it's much, much harder to do. It's difficult to be able to discuss and explore with participants. It's a harder question to ask of why someone didn't do something than why they actually did. But could arguably lead to significantly useful, valuable, and relevant insights, not just in terms of how do you actually get innovation to be implemented successfully, but what are the innovations that are typically unsuccessful, and what are the features of those that we should understand, and what is the diffusion failures that also need to be considered. But broadly, there's a lack of consideration of failure when diffusion doesn't work and when the innovations themselves don't work. Related to that, and I think significant critique that is really relevant and really doesn't get enough play, is what he identifies as the sources and allocation of blame. And what he differentiates between is individual blame versus system blame. And this is implicitly built into the language by which we talk about people at different stages. And so, for example, the term laggard. And so again, the stages that Rogers identifies within the book, we have innovators that are the very, very early adopters. We have the early adopters themselves, which represent, typically speaking, about 1/6 of the overall population. We have then the early majority, we have the late majority, and then we have the laggards at the end that are theoretically brought kicking and screaming to adoption of the technology. And that term, laggard, is viewed as a pejorative. It's viewed as insulting. It is viewed as an unacceptable term. And so the use of it and the allocation of people as laggards typically is viewed as a criticism of them as human beings. It's individual blame. It's they failed to recognize and adopt the thing that was being introduced. And so here we see two different phenomena at play at the same time. The pro-innovation bias of innovation is good, the innovation is good, you should want it, and the blaming of individuals when they don't. Now, speaking personally, having read through this, I have been at all stages of the overall model. I've talked about, my adoption of cell phones. I was literally one of the very first people in Canada to have a BlackBerry. I had one the first week that they came out. I don't want to think about the number of Palm Pilots, the number of cell phones that I've actually worked through, as I have attempted to be able to manage and maintain a level of productivity and mobility and managing of my career where I am rarely actually in the same place at the same time for more than a very short period. And so I was seeking solutions to, for want of a better term, mobile productivity. But I would also argue that, I've been pretty middle of the road. I've been probably early majority in some instances. I've been late majority in others, and I've been an absolute outright laggard in further ones. Today, my iPhone is a Model 8 in 2022. It was released in 2017. It is 5 years old. It works just fine, and I am in no way feeling compelled to actually replace it until it dies. My car was built in 2009, and again, I have no call to replace it until it dies. Yes, there are new sexy cars with, modern technology and better cell phone interfaces and Bluetooth integration and performance and design and fuel efficiency. Sure, let's go there. Do I have any interest in buying one? No. The car I have is perfectly good. I don't need to have the latest, and the shiniest, and the newest. There are those that do, that at least every 2 or 3 years trade them in on a regular basis, and value and like that, and that's fine. They are car enthusiasts, or they are working to keep up with the Joneses, or they appreciate the status that comes with driving the latest and greatest. That is not me. There are instances where I'm absolutely an early adopter, and there are absolutely instances where I'm a laggard as well, and I wear that with pride. But what's ignored in that is the reason for that is my needs are already met, or there isn't compelling value in what's being offered today to actually get me to be able to make the change. And that's really what's often motivating late adopters and late majority and laggards, is a disconnect between their values and what they are looking to see and what they want and what's actually on offer. And again, the idea of the source of blame, individual blame, places the fault with them. It's a failing on their part to actually be creative or innovative or accepting or willing to adopt or make the change, as opposed to as a product of the system. And this is particularly true when we think about managing organizational change. For example, the introduction of new processes or new systems or new capabilities is the resistance is viewed as personal stubbornness and lack of will to comply, as opposed to because what's being on offer isn't materially sufficiently better that people are actually willing to be able to make the change. And so there's a tendency towards individual blame rather than placing blame where blame very often is with the system and the failure of the system to be able to either offer meaningful innovation or to be able to adapt or introduce it in a way, or to be able to allow changes to it in a way that could actually make that work. Which leads to another fundamental critique that Rogers talks about, which is the process of reinvention. The idea that when we think about the diffusion of innovations, it's typically described as introducing an idea in the form that it holds. And so it's, using this piece of software or using this technology or using this idea or using this concept. What reinvention talks about is being able to say, I see value in the kernel of that idea, But what would really make it useful is if I did this. And where there is often the greatest degree of resistance to that, and there are diffusions that are actually reinvention hostile, that work to be able to make it as difficult as possible to engage in reinvention. The idea that you have a right to repair of your John Deere tractor, for example, because yes, that's a thing. Or the right to repair your iPhone, which is theoretically yours, and yet in many degrees, based upon the wording of the license agreements, actually not. The ability to actually open it up or repair it or tailor it or customize it or change it in some way is actively discouraged out to outright prohibited. Any organization that implements a capability or a process or a framework under the label of best practices and simply parachutes it in, and this happens all the time, there is a rejection of reinvention, of adapting it, of being able to make it work, of being able to say, good idea, however, for it to work for me in this context, within this environment, I would need to do it this way instead. And so there are instances where reinvention is seen as being a feature of the diffusion of innovation, but there are very, very many instances where it's actually seen as a bug and something that actually should be stomped out. And he also talks about problems of units of analysis. And this is, again, an academic sounding argument, and arguably it is, but it's a very practical and really important one as well, because the unit of response in terms of diffusion studies is often the individual. Why did a person take and adopt an innovation or not? Why did farmers start using a specific seed variety? Why did they change what their crop rotation or their fertilizing practices were? Why did they upgrade and adopt a new tractor? All of the responses around that tend to engage in surveys and exploration of the motives of the individual. Because the unit of response is the individual, the unit of analysis is also perceived to be the individual. And yet more information can be obtained by how do networks as a whole integrate and interface in terms of disseminating and making available and making widely known information about an idea, about an innovation. Who did you hear it from? What was the most influential recommendation that led you to actually adopt this? And be able to understand the broader network. And we see this now within community network analysis, which is very much trying to explore the network impact and the network influences, and has actually become a different dimension of diffusion research, but it's relatively new and still relatively sporadic in how it's applied. But in many cases, the adoptions aren't about the individual, they're about organizations, and they're about whole societies, and understanding as well the influences that are at play, and the values, and the principles, and the precepts, and the traditions, and the biases that lead to the adoption or non-adoption of an idea. So let's talk about where this fits. It is a book of research, and it's a book about research. And it's a particular irony of that is that its study is the topic of innovation. And one of the fundamental laments of Rogers is that for the most part, the study of that, or the study of the diffusion of innovation, has become remarkably formulaic and unchanging. From the pioneers that did some of the first diffusion studies, there has been a lot of replication of the same tools and approaches, and very little, again, adaptation and evolution of how that might actually work, or exploration of new territory and understanding of new questions that might get explored. It explores the research, it goes into incredible detail on what we actually know about diffusion, and it's candid and frank about what we don't know and what hasn't happened yet. Bottom line, is the diffusion of innovation something you should read? Interesting question. To explore that in a little bit more detail, first I'm actually going to share with you a little bit about the book, and we're going to dive into that. And so we're talking about the organizational influences. This is from the chapter Innovation in Organizations. And specifically what we're going to talk about is the practice of agenda setting as part of the diffusion of innovation process. Now, agenda setting occurs when a general organizational problem is defined that creates a perceived need for an innovation, figure 10-3. The agenda setting process is continuously underway in every system, determining what the system will work on first, next, and so forth. Agenda setting is the way in which needs, problems, and issues bubble up through a system and are prioritized in a hierarchy for attention. The agenda setting stage in the innovation process in an organization consists of 1, identifying and prioritizing needs and problems, and 2, searching the organization's environment to locate innovations of potential usefulness to be able to meet these organizational problems. The agenda setting stage may require an extended period of time, often several years. The case studies of the innovation process conducted by the Minnesota Innovation Research Program led to the conclusion that innovations are not initiated on the spur of the moment, nor by a single dramatic incident, nor by a single entrepreneur. Agenda setting initiates the sequence of the innovation process, for it is here that the initial motivation is generated to impel later steps in the innovation process. At the agenda setting stage, 1 or more individuals in an organization identify an important problem and then identify an innovation as one means of coping with the problem. A performance gap is the discrepancy between an organization's expectations and its actual performance. This difference between how an organization's members perceive its performance in comparison to what they feel it should be can be a strong impetus to seek an innovation. Generalization 10.4 states a performance gap can trigger the innovation process. The Minnesota Innovation Research Program showed that in most cases, a shock to the organization reached a threshold of attention and led to action by the organization's participants. This shock, often caused by direct personal confrontation with needs or problems, led an organization to initiate the innovation process. In other words, something had to go wrong before the organization was willing to do something about it. Most organizations engage in an opportunistic surveillance by scanning the environment for new ideas that might benefit the organizations. As March noted, innovation in organizations often seems to be driven less by problems than by solutions. Answers often precede questions. Most organizations face multiple problems, but possess knowledge of only a few innovations that offer solutions. So the chance of identifying an innovation to cope with a particular problem is relatively small. But if organizational members begin with a wanted solution, there's a good chance the innovation will match some problem faced by the organization. Consequently, most organizations continuously scan for innovations and match a promising innovation with one of their relevant problems. Now, it's a well-written book, but it's a dense book. It's a densely written book. It takes time to read. It takes a lot longer, in my experience, to read than your average book. So should you read it? If you are trying to understand the world of change, and if you really want to appreciate what's required in terms of being able to make transformation happen, and if you're prepared to do the work of reading it, and the work of applying the results of the reading, then I think there's a lot of value in it. Why? Learning and exposure and solid grounding in worlds that are often viewed as being disparate, but that are actually inextricably connected. What's being explored here isn't just the innovation process. It's not just the change management process. It's not just the communication process. It's all of that inextricably entwined together. It's how innovation occurs, how decision-making around innovations occur, how communication in support of that does or does not happen, and how choices are ultimately made or not made to adopt an innovation the way it is offered or in a slightly different way. What should you look for within that? I would argue very strongly, be prepared to confront your biases. You're going to have preconceived notions of what this book is about because many of the ideas have been popularized. Many of the terms that it coined are in broad relative usage, but aren't necessarily used the way that Rogers themselves actually means them. And while many of the concepts are commonly understood or commonly approached or commonly appreciated, they're again not necessarily with the detail that was actually intended and the background and the context. And so you're going to find notions and ideas that challenge your perceptions. That's a good conflict to wrestle with, but it's one you need to know you're going to need to be able to wrestle with. How deep should you go? This is a deep rabbit hole. And it's easy to go very deep, and it's also very easy to get lost that way, to be able to get immersed in a chapter or a section of a chapter and be reading it and rereading it over and over again and thinking about what it actually means. Personally, I struggle with this. I am still, as a reader, learning to skim. It is not something that I do naturally. It is not something I really like to do. I enjoy words and I enjoy language and I enjoy reading and I value very well written books and I want to enjoy the books for what they are. But when we're reading for ideas, when we're reading for instruction, when we're reading for learning, and we're trying to read for context, we've got to adopt different approaches and use different tools. And so doing a informed scan first, understanding what the basic principles of the book are, being able to scan the overall structure, know how it's laid out, know what's coming, what the major heads are. Taking time to just simply, before you read the book, read the summary of the chapters at the conclusion of each chapter. And because this is an academic research book, they are there, and they are well crafted, and they are relatively well exhaustive in summarizing what's there. It's going to be a really good orientation to the landscape. Because the landscape is important to understand in this book because it covers a lot of territory. It is, I can say without question, one of the few landmark books that can benefit from reading and rereading. I don't make that recommendation lightly. There are few books on my shelf that particularly are nonfiction that I would want to or expect to go back again and again. This would absolutely and arguably be one of them. And you're going to take away new insights and new perspectives and new ideas and new understanding every single time that you do. Thanks for joining us on Strategy Books. We'll be back with another episode soon. If you're interested in the books that we talked about today, you can find links to them in the description below. Be sure to subscribe, and if you enjoyed today's recording, please hit that like button as well and help others be able to find the recording. Let me know what you got out of the book in the comments below, and comment as well if you've got any questions or if you have ideas for a future book.